Hi, my name is William Mays, and I am a Michigan criminal defense lawyer. And today, I'm going to present what is, in essence, a PowerPoint presentation that was developed for criminal defense lawyers here in the state of Michigan to help them with their cross-examination of police officers on standardized field sobriety tests. I got thinking after I'd done up this PowerPoint that there's a lot of police officers that I've gotten to know online, and I've never fully laid out what the problem is that I have with the field sobriety tests. So I think that a lot of police officers will get a benefit out of this, but if you've been charged with a drunk driving, it's also good to know what exactly these field sobriety tests actually mean. So I took this original training way back in 2004. I subsequently went on and took the instructor course. I have taught a couple of courses where I've taught criminal defense lawyers the standardized field sobriety test battery, the entire course, and I've also been qualified as an expert witness by a number of Michigan courts and testified in front of juries regarding field sobriety tests. So back in 2004, though, when I took this course, we were taught that HGN is 77% accurate, meaning that if there were 4 or more clues, an arrest decision was made 77% of the time that was accurate. Walk and turn, 2 clues or more, 68% of the time, there would be an accurate arrest decision, and one leg stand, 65% if there were 2 or more clues. Now, that implies, of course, though, that, hey, HGN is only 77% accurate. That would mean that 23% inaccuracy, right? Well, that's not how these tests work. And nowadays, police officers, since I believe 2015, have been getting trained that the field sobriety tests are even more reliable than what they were 20 some odd years ago. They're now trained out of the San Diego study that HGN is 88% accurate, walk and turn is 79% accurate, and the one leg stand is 83% accurate. The fact of the matter is that police officers do not understand statistics at all. And 98% or 98.7% of police officers don't understand statistics. 73.52% of all statistics are made up. And I know a statistics joke, but it's mean. If you see up there on the Dunning-Kruger graph, I've got the confidence of a police officer who has recently taken the NHTSA course is just way up there. And down in the pit of despair when they're cross-examined. Later on, they follow me on TikTok and they follow me on YouTube, and you get to learn all this great information regarding the field sobriety test battery. But what we see in the history and development of standardized field sobriety tests is a long history of fraud. There's no, pulling punches on this. As I go through these materials, you will see that the standardized field sobriety test battery is not what it's all cracked up to be. So back before 1977, when the initial study was brought out by the Southern California Research Institute, police officers were using a wide variety of tests to determine whether or not a person may have consumed too much alcohol. One of the tests that was more notorious, they would reach into their pocket, pull out some change, and throw a bunch of change on the ground and say, without bending your knees, pick up 27 cents. And if they failed, they'd go to jail. They'd take off that Smokey the Bear hat and blow into my hat. And you know that if you're blowing into the hat, you're going to go to jail. They used other things like alphabet and counting backwards. But in the 60s and early 70s, field sobriety testing was pretty rudimentary. The goal was to arrest those people who were too drunk to be driving. But in fact, more often than not, these officers were releasing the person or telling the motorist, go get a cup of coffee before you drive anymore, or even giving them a ride home. And that led to a great increase in the number of alcohol-related accidents, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration wanted to curb the number of drinking and driving accidents. So in 1975, a grant was issued to the Southern California Research Institute to explore which tests had proved to be the most reliable tests. Now, I have to emphasize, they were not charged with inventing tests. Their initial research was only designed to determine what tests were in use, and of those tests, which ones were accurate and could reliably discriminate between people who were over the legal limit and under the legal limit. But in fact, that's not what the Southern California Research Institute actually did. This is Marceline Burns that you see up on the photograph there. Dr. Burns has made millions of dollars by developing standardized field sobriety tests from as far back as 1975, with her most recent publication, I believe, was in 2007. She has been a frequent speaker across the country. The field sobriety tests that her and another researcher by the name of Herbert Moskowitz created have gone on to all 50 states, and they're now used internationally in foreign jurisdictions. So this was big money. Back in 1975, I don't have the exact numbers for how much money was made at that time, but the estimates are between $200,000 and $300,000, which, if you adjust for inflation, is approximately $2 million. And that resulted in the 1977 study, which explored 16 different tests that were supposedly in use at that time, evaluating those tests using 38 drinking subjects. 10 police officers were used in this initial pilot study, and they reduced the number of tests from 16 down to 6 and then ultimately to 3 tests. So this is a very small number of people that are being used to make policy changes and field sobriety tests that will later go on to affect such a huge number of people globally. I mean, on the pie chart, that's kind of a joke that I've got there. The police officers are represented in yellow, and the drinking subjects are represented in red. And of course, it's a blue circle because this is a extreme statistical minority. And only 2 researchers. At that time, there were only 2 researchers, along with some assistants, at the Southern California Research Institute doing this study. Now, the original tests that were explored, alphabet. Alphabet was later rejected because of language and educational barriers. Counting backward. Of course, counting backward was being used by police officers at that time, along with the alphabet. Counting backwards and the alphabet would later resurface in the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's standardized field sobriety test battery as a quote-unquote additional technique. Grip strength. This shows you that the Southern California Research Institute researchers were really grasping for straws. You can see in that photograph, that fella is holding a grip strength meter, which will allow them to determine how many pounds of pressure that person's able to exert onto the device. Who in their right mind would think that having something to drink would affect your grip strength? Additional tests: maze tracing, telegraph key, typing a 10-second tapping exercise, finger count, and that later resurfaces as an additional technique, finger to nose, which later resurfaces in the A-RIDE and Drug Recognition Expert program, tongue twisters such as Methodist, Episcopal, Sophisticated, and Statistics. 2-point tactile discrimination. 2-point tactile discrimination involves something where you're grabbing parts of the arm and asking the person, where am I touching you? Ah, boy. And a serial performance, which involves some type of a gizmo, which to this day, I'm still not exactly sure what exactly it entailed, but it entailed some sort of equipment, according to the 77 study, and then a color numbering sequence. As you can see, though, a lot of these tests were completely made out of whole cloth. There was no grip strengthometer back in the 60s or the 70s that police officers were towing around in their cars to determine whether or not a person had been drinking. The 1977 study, ultimately, it resulted in a 3-test battery, which was the walk and turn, one-leg stand, and alcohol gaze nystagmus. Now, officers, if you're paying attention, I did not say horizontal gaze nystagmus. I said alcohol gaze nystagmus. Alcohol gaze nystagmus is different from the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. It involved covering one eye and using a device in the laboratory that moved a metal stimulus at a rate of approximately 10 degrees per second to measure each eye mechanically. It was not the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. HGN does not actually surface until the 1981 study. Now, there were 6 finalists, as I indicated earlier. 3 of them were rejected out of that final 6. The final 6 that were rejected were finger to nose, finger count, and a tracing test. Again, tracing was never being used by police officers out in the field, and the researchers determined that carrying around a coloring book in the car would just be a little too awkward for a lot of cops. Anyway, the 1977 study was an abysmal failure. In that initial research, which then went on to be used against a large number of people, 46.5% of the people who were under the legal limit were arrested. They were arrested on the allegation that they were over the legal limit. And of course, the officers knew that they were part of this pilot project and that they were supposed to make accurate arrest or release decisions. Even Marceline Burns herself said that this is totally unacceptable. And she writes in the study, quote, "Obviously an error rate of 47% in making arrests is not acceptable." But she added, actually, officers are reluctant to err in the direction of false alarms. What she is saying there is that she honestly believed back in 1977 that police officers, if they came across somebody that they suspected might be drunk, would rather release. And maybe that was true in the 60s and the 70s, but it's certainly not true today.
The Commerce Police Department charged innocent people with driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol who insisted all along there was no evidence to make an arrest.
That finding comes from a Fox 5 team analysis of DUI arrests, some of which have already been dismissed. Fox 5 team reporter Randy Travis says the chief was made aware of the first case nearly a year ago. Randy.
Courtney and Tom, these people did not have any drugs on them or smell like they've been drinking. They were pulled over on minor traffic violations, with the officer deciding he could tell they were under the influence, despite some obvious signs suggesting otherwise.
Thought I was coming down here to have dinner with my friends, listen to some people sing some karaoke, and then go home.
You been drinking tonight?
But apparently he had other ideas.
It had been more than 3 hours since Aaron Cash says he had any alcohol that night last April. Commerce police officer Cody Wood said Cash crossed the center line as he drove away. We can't confirm because the city said the dash cam video was lost during a transfer to a new system.
7, 8, 9.
But it's clear from Wood's body cam, after putting the 22-year-old through a series of tests and looking into his eyes, he thought Cash was drunk.
Are you sure you only had 1 beer and 1 shot?
Yes, sir.
Because that's not what I'm saying.
But Officer Wood failed to put in his report something he did see: the results of a breathalyzer field test to detect alcohol. Cash blew a 000, no alcohol detected, not just once, but 8 times at the scene. The officer even trying a different device borrowed from his sergeant.
Giving 000s.
Yet they still decided to charge Aaron Cash with DUI.
I think I'm probably about to lose my job, too.
At the jail, Officer Wood called in a Jefferson police officer who was certified to use a more elaborate alcohol sensor. Cash blew 2 more times and then waited for the Jefferson cop to read the results.
He starts looking through the paperwork, and then he looks up at me, looks over at the arresting officer, looks back at me, says, "Is this an effing joke?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because you blew 000s twice. Like, you're not drunk. I don't know why you're here."
Even though he had now passed 10 breath tests, Wood still charged Cash with drunk driving. It was eventually dismissed.
And that case is not unlike a recent case that we had here in Michigan, where a national from Japan was here on business in the state of Michigan and was arrested with a .02 bodily alcohol content, and ultimately ended up suing the department and won just shy of $400,000, despite the existence of qualified immunity and governmental immunity. That person succeeded in a civil lawsuit for the false arrest. So that's the exception and not the rule, though. the vast majority of wrongful arrests in drunk driving cases do not result in any type of an award. Now, in 1977, in that original pilot research, we found that the vast majority of subjects that were being tested were mostly young and mostly male. So 80% of the subjects were in their 20s, and about 2/3 of them in the 77 study were men. And of course, young men are more athletic than a 55-year-old woman or a 63-year-old man. The 1981 study came out, obviously, just a few years after the 77 study. This was to implement the actual tests themselves. The 77 study had recommended further research, particularly in light of that 47% error rate, and they set out to try to determine whether or not these tests could actually be used in the field. In the 1981 study, we see for the first time divided attention tasks. In the 77 study, they were not concerned about divided attention, but officers watching this video, their entire standardized field sobriety training course emphasizes repeatedly divided attention tasks. They're trained that an impaired motorist has difficulty dividing his or her attention. That is, doing two things at once. Now, in the 1981 study, this is the first time that exclusively the standardized field sobriety test battery, as we know it today, was actually used. And this was horizontal gaze nystagmus, walk and turn, and one-leg stand. At that time, however, we found out that HGN was already a fraud. The researchers, and incidentally, they picked out three researchers this time. Tharp joined the Southern California Research Institute, and officers may have heard of Tharp's equation. Tharp's equation was the theory that you could determine what a person's bodily alcohol content was based upon the angle of onset of nystagmus in the eye. This has been universally rejected as junk science in every state that I'm aware of. No one has ever allowed Tharp's equation to be used in court, but it still makes appearances in the standardized field sobriety training materials as if it were legitimate science. It's not. In the 1981 study, they picked out 42 sober individuals from their research team and from people that hadn't been dosed, and they tested them for nystagmus. Half of the people in the group had nystagmus present. Furthermore, they wrote in the study, we recommend that the stimulus be moved fairly slowly, i.e. at a rate of 10 degrees per second, but not too slowly, otherwise the normal oscillations of the eyeball may be mistaken for nystagmus. They no longer teach that in the standardized training course. They don't teach you that if you move the stimulus too slowly, that it will appear that there's nystagmus in the eye. That's just simply the normal oscillations of the eye. The walk and turn test in 1981, I'll pull this up, it indicated that certain individuals have difficulty with this test, including people who are over the age of 65, people with back, leg, or middle ear problems, and people with high-heeled shoes over 2 inches. We recommend that only the nystagmus test be used with the first 4 categories of stoppees. Now, that's just simply incredible. Nowadays, of course, officers are trained that if the person indicates that they have one of these disabilities, a problem with their back, leg, or middle ear, or if the person is actually 65 years of age or older, the officer tells them, well, we'll try your best anyway. Back in 1981, they were telling officers that you should only use the nystagmus test if, in fact, they have any one of these. And of course, with high heels, you have the subject take the heels off. Same thing for the one-leg stand. If back, leg, middle ear issues, if the person is over the age of 65, or if the person is 50 pounds or more overweight, then the 1981 study said only do the nystagmus test. And I've got the citations down here, so you can actually look this up, go online and pull the 1981 study and verify for yourself on that page that, in fact, I'm not making this stuff up, right? So the problem with the 1981 study is that out of 118 arrest decisions by the officers to arrest, 32% of them were wrong. They're wrong. And so They took it from 47% down to 32%, so that's good, I guess, right? But there was still this tremendously high arrest rate. But worse still, 1 in 5 false arrests had no alcohol whatsoever on board. Can you imagine confusing trip zeros, 0.000, with a 0.10 or greater? Because that's what the law was at that time, 0.10 or greater. And they're confusing it with 0.000. That is just crazy. So the 1981 study, Ms. Burns explained that some of these false arrests were probably the result of the tests being conducted next to the drug capital of the world, as if, they had all these druggies that somehow slipped into their study and they didn't know it. There is no evidence to suggest that Dr. Burns was correct about that. This was made up out of whole cloth. The 1981 study also established, let me pull this up. The officers in the 1981 study believed that 31% of the people who were at a 0.05 BAC were impaired. So that just goes to show you that half the legal limit, and they thought that they were impaired. But how did they get that number down from 32% or from 47% down to 32%? Because that is still a remarkable improvement, but there's an explanation. It's the dosing differential. You see, 33% of the motorists in this case, or the subjects in this case, were 0.00. 34% were 0.05, and 11% were 0.15s. All of these are gimmies. 78% of the subject body were gimmies. They were either clearly intoxicated, really kind of hammered, or they were plainly sober, half the legal limit, or all zeros. These should have just have been givens. But then we get to the fact that only 22% were even close to a 0.10. Now, NHTSA claimed that they had a 0.80 accuracy when they were using the 3-test battery, but individuals that were dosed between 0.05 and 0.15 would have undoubtedly have been lower accuracy rates, but they eliminated that data from the study altogether. The dosing differential is also why we see a reduction from 46.5% error rate down to 32%. The number of people that were dosed in the mid-range from 05 to 15 went from 27% in the 1977 study to only 22% in the 81 study. And now, inter-rater reliability. Inter-rater reliability is an important concept in statistics. It essentially means that if there is excellent inter-rater reliability, everyone will agree. So Officer A will agree with Officer B, who will also agree with me. If there's excellent inter-rater reliability, me and 2 officers can walk in, watch some video where there's a close-up of the person's eyes. We watch the walk and turn performance, and we watch the one-leg stand, and we will all agree that there are, let's say, 4 clues on the HGN. Which clues are those? Well, it's the lack of smooth pursuit and distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation. Did you see nystagmus prior to 45 degrees? No, I didn't. Did you? No, I didn't either. Did you? No, I didn't either. What about on the walk and turn? Well, I saw that the subject started too soon and took an incorrect number of steps. Officer A agrees, Officer B agrees, and then finally on the one-leg stand, we all agree that he places his foot down once and there's noticeable body sway. If we agree on all of those clues, then there's excellent inter-rater reliability. Unfortunately, however, inter-rater reliability has always been a problem with the standardized field sobriety test battery. It's around a 0.57, which, as you can see on this graph, falls within fair to poor because officers, in fact, do not agree on what clues that they see. They'll come up with a mishmash and no one agrees. They might agree to arrest, but they all agree to arrest for different reasons. And again, in the 1981 study, most of the subjects were young men. 80% of the subjects were between the ages of 21 and 34, and about 2/3 of them were men. So again, we're not validating these initial standardized field sobriety test battery on the entire range of people that are out there. We're not testing to see how proficient 55-year-olds with arthritis are on these tests. We're instead, I'll tell you what, the reason why it was primarily young men is that the Southern California Research Institute is located near a bunch of colleges, and they would put out flyers advertising that you'd get free beer and paid a couple of bucks. And so the majority of people who responded to the inquiries to be subject test participants were young men. So the HGN was picked up by peer-reviewed researchers in the 1980s. This is the Good-Osberger study. It's probably the most notable and earliest paper that attempts to perpetrate the fraud that is HGN. Gregory Good and Carol Osberger published this paper in 1986. It was sponsored by the Ohio State Highway Patrol. They determined that correct arrest decisions are made when an officer finds 4 or more clues on the HGN test 92% of the time. 92, I mean, hey, we're getting close to 100, right? Well, that's not the full story, though, because as you can see, and this is directly out of the peer-reviewed study, 81.5% of people who were below the legal limit had 4 or more clues. The numbers, the data is right there in the study, and yet they're publishing this as if this is a great test. Why would you report that these numbers are so strong when you see that the false arrest rate is 81.5%? That's a ridiculous number. Obviously, somewhere between 80 and 90% of people have 4 or more clues on the HGN, period. It doesn't matter if they're drunk or sober or anything in between. They're going to have 4 or more clues 80 to 90% of the time. And we will see this repeated over and over again throughout all the NHTSA research that attempts to validate the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. So now is just about a good time to take a break. This is the history of field sobriety tests. We're going to get into the 1990s validation studies next. Of course, as everyone is aware, the legal blood alcohol level went from 0.10 to 0.8. And so now the national standard is 0.8. What did NHTSA do in order to accommodate the new lower legal limit? Did they invent new tests? Or did they invent new scoring techniques? I can tell you this, before we go into part 2, the Southern California Research Institute stepped right up and said, hey, we're more than happy to take another government grant, and we will get through this research and produce for you a fine product. Until the next video, thanks for watching. I'll see you in part 2.